The whispers cut through the humid June air like shrapnel. I could hear them from 3 rows back, the other parents leaning into each other with that particular brand of suburban cruelty that masquerades as concern. "Poor Marcus," one of them murmured, shaking her perfectly coiffed head. "What a shame his father turned out to be such a disappointment." Another voice chimed in, dripping with false sympathy. "I heard he never even finished college, works at some warehouse now. How embarrassing for the family." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I sat perfectly still in my folding chair, wearing my only decent shirt and a tie I'd borrowed from my neighbor. My hands, scarred and weathered from years of manual labor, gripped the graduation program so tightly, the paper began to tear. Around me, the other parents wore their success like armor, designer suits, expensive watches, the casual confidence that comes from never having to choose between groceries and rent. Then my son Marcus stepped up to the podium as valedictorian, and for a moment the whispers stopped. He looked so much like his mother in that cap and gown, the same determined set to his jaw, the same fire in his dark eyes. My chest swelled with a pride so fierce it nearly choked me. This brilliant young man, this future doctor, who had earned a full scholarship to Harvard Medical School, was mine. Despite everything they thought they knew about me, despite all their judgments, I had raised him. Marcus began his speech, his voice clear and strong as it carried across the crowded gymnasium. But then he said something that made my blood freeze. He spoke about overcoming obstacles, about succeeding despite having a father who couldn't provide the advantages other kids had. A father who was absent for most of his childhood. A father who never understood the importance of education or ambition. The words hit me like physical blows, each one carefully chosen, each one designed to distance himself from the man he thought I was. The crowd murmured approvingly. Here was a success story they could understand. A young man rising above his circumstances, transcending his father's limitations. They had no idea that every word was a dagger to my heart, that the very absence he condemned had been my greatest sacrifice for him. That's when my phone vibrated. In the middle of my son's graduation speech, as he systematically dismantled everything I thought we had built together, an unknown number appeared on my screen. I almost ignored it, but something made me look at the caller ID more carefully. The area code was one I recognized, one that still made my pulse quicken after all these years. Washington, D.C. The call that would change everything came at the exact moment my son told an auditorium full of people that his father was a failure. The irony wasn't lost on me, even as my world began to shift on its axis. But to understand how we got to this moment, you need to know the story that led here, the truth that only 3 people in the world knew, and the price I paid to keep it buried. My name is David Chen, and I haven't always been the warehouse worker my neighbors think I am. 22 years ago, I was Colonel David Chen, United States Army Special Operations, and I was one of the most decorated officers of my generation. I had a corner office in the Pentagon, a security clearance that opened doors most people didn't even know existed, and a future that stretched out before me like a golden highway. I also had a 3-year-old son, and a wife I loved more than my own life. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning in September. I was reviewing intelligence reports in my office when Sarah called, her voice tight with worry. Marcus had been running a fever for 3 days, and the doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong. The pediatric specialists at Walter Reed wanted to run more tests, expensive tests, that our military insurance would cover, but only if I could be there to sign the paperwork and make the decisions. It should have been simple. A few hours away from the office to take care of my sick child. But that Tuesday morning, I was also scheduled to brief the Joint Chiefs on a highly classified operation that had been months in the planning. Lives hung in the balance, national security implications that I couldn't even begin to explain to Sarah without violating a dozen federal laws. I chose my son. I chose my family. I told my commanding officer that I had a family emergency and needed to postpone the briefing. General Morrison, a man whose idea of work-life balance was bringing paperwork home for the weekend, looked at me like I'd suggested we surrender to our enemies. "Your son has a cold, Colonel Chen," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "The Joint Chiefs are waiting. This is your career we're talking about." I stood my ground. "With respect, sir, my son comes first. Always." The briefing was moved to the following day, but the damage was done. In the unforgiving culture of military command, I had shown weakness. I had chosen personal obligations over professional duty. It didn't matter that the operation ultimately succeeded, that my delay had no impact on the outcome. What mattered was the perception that I wasn't fully committed, that I might choose family over country again when the stakes were even higher. The punishment was swift and surgical. I wasn't court-martialed or publicly disgraced. That would have been too obvious, too messy. Instead, I was quietly reassigned to increasingly meaningless positions, shuffled from office to office like a piece of furniture nobody wanted but couldn't quite throw away. My security clearance was reduced, my access restricted, my opinions politely ignored in meetings where I once commanded respect. When Sarah was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 2 years later, I knew exactly what it meant. The medical bills would be astronomical, even with military insurance. The treatments she needed weren't available at military hospitals, and the best specialists were in private practice. I needed money, and I needed it fast. That's when I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. I could have stayed in the army, collecting my pension while my wife died slowly because we couldn't afford the best care. Or I could leave, forfeit everything I'd worked for, and find a way to save her life. I chose Sarah. I chose Marcus. I chose love over career, family over glory, hope over security. I submitted my resignation on a Friday afternoon, effective immediately. I walked out of the Pentagon with nothing but my personal effects in a cardboard box and a secret that would follow me for the next 2 decades. The military doesn't like loose ends, and a decorated colonel who suddenly becomes a civilian raises questions. To protect national security and maintain the integrity of ongoing operations, my service record was classified at the highest levels. Officially, I had never existed in the capacity I'd served. My medals, my commendations, my years of sacrifice for my country, all of it disappeared into a vault somewhere beneath the Pentagon. To the world, to my new neighbors, to everyone except Sarah and Marcus, I was just another guy who couldn't hack it in the real world. The civilian job market wasn't kind to a former military officer with no verifiable work history. My resume was full of gaps that I couldn't explain, accomplishments I couldn't claim, skills I couldn't prove. The warehouse job was the best I could find, honest work that paid enough to cover Sarah's treatments and keep food on the table. For 3 years, I loaded trucks and moved boxes during the day, then sat beside Sarah's hospital bed at night, holding her hand while poison dripped into her veins, hoping against hope that love would be enough to save her. Sometimes I would catch her looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, a mixture of gratitude and guilt that broke my heart. "You gave up everything for us," she would whisper, when the pain medication made her philosophical. I would squeeze her hand and tell her the truth, that giving up my career was the easiest decision I'd ever made, that every moment with her and Marcus was worth more than all the medals and commendations in the world. She died on a Thursday morning in March, with spring rain pattering against the hospital window and Marcus sleeping in the chair beside her bed. Her last words to me were a promise that she would make sure Marcus understood, that she would tell him what his father had sacrificed. But cancer doesn't care about promises, and 10-year-old boys don't understand the complexities of adult choices. In the years that followed, as Marcus grew from a confused child into a brilliant teenager, I watched him create his own narrative about our life. He saw the small apartment, the secondhand clothes, the father who worked with his hands instead of his mind. He saw what looked like failure and drew his own conclusions. I could have told him the truth. I could have shown him the newspaper clippings I'd saved, the photos of me in uniform, the letters of commendation that proved I'd once been someone important. But those documents were supposed to be destroyed, and revealing them would have put us both in danger. The classification of my service wasn't just about national security. It was about protecting the people I loved from the enemies I'd made in the shadows. So I let him believe the lie. I let him think his father was a disappointment, a man who'd never amounted to anything. It was easier than explaining why I couldn't attend his school events during certain hours, why I sometimes disappeared for days without explanation when old contacts needed favors, why our phone was tapped and our mail was monitored by people who were supposed to be on our side. Now, sitting in that gymnasium listening to my son's graduation speech, I realized that my silence had created something I'd never intended. In protecting Marcus from the truth, I'd also protected him from understanding who I really was. The man he described in his speech, absent, uncommitted, lacking in ambition. That wasn't me. That was the ghost I'd created to keep him safe. The phone in my pocket vibrated again, insistent and urgent. The number was still there, still waiting, still representing a world I'd thought I'd left behind forever. As Marcus concluded his speech to thunderous applause, as the other parents wiped away tears of pride and joy, I made a decision that would once again change everything. I answered the phone. The voice on the other end of the line was crisp, professional, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Colonel Chen, this is Secretary of Defense Patricia Wells. We need to talk. Immediately. I stepped out of the gymnasium, my legs feeling unsteady as I walked past clusters of celebrating families. The June heat hit me like a wall, but it was nothing compared to the chill that ran down my spine. Secretary Wells knew my real rank, my real identity. After 22 years of careful anonymity, someone in Washington was breaking the silence. Sir, with all due respect, I said, keeping my voice low as I found a quiet spot behind the school building. I think you have the wrong number. I'm just a warehouse worker from Ohio. My clearance was revoked decades ago. Her laugh was sharp, humorless. Cut the act, David. 3 hours ago, a terrorist cell we've been tracking for 18 months executed a coordinated attack on 3 military installations across Europe. They used tactics, timing, and inside knowledge that could only come from someone with intimate familiarity with our most classified protocols. My mouth went dry. The implications were staggering, but what terrified me more was why she was calling me about it. Ma'am, I've been out of the loop for over 2 decades. I drive a forklift for a living now. The protocols they used, she continued, ignoring my protest, were from Operation Nightfall. Ring any bells, Colonel? The world seemed to tilt sideways. Operation Nightfall had been my brainchild, a counterterrorism strategy so sensitive that only 7 people in the entire U.S. government had been briefed on it. I had developed it during my final year at the Pentagon, a theoretical framework for preventing exactly the kind of coordinated attack she was describing. That operation was theoretical only, I said, my training taking over despite my shock. It was never implemented. The files were sealed. Were sealed, she corrected. Someone with alpha-level clearance accessed those files 6 months ago. Someone used your playbook against us, David. And right now, you're the only person alive who knows that system well enough to help us figure out how they're going to strike next. The graduation ceremony was ending behind me. I could hear the cheers, the applause, the sound of families celebrating their children's achievements. Marcus would be looking for me soon, expecting his father to take pictures, to share in his moment of triumph. Instead, I was being pulled back into a world I'd spent 2 decades trying to escape. I need 48 hours to consider this, I said, stalling for time I didn't have. You have 20 minutes, Secretary Wells replied. A helicopter is already en route to your location. We'll have you in Washington within the hour. Ma'am, I can't just disappear. My son just graduated. This is supposed to be his day. Colonel, she said, and for the first time her voice carried a note of genuine sympathy, I understand what I'm asking of you. But if we don't stop these attacks, thousands of families won't have any more days to celebrate. Your country needs you. Again. The line went dead. I stood there for a moment, phone still pressed to my ear, watching parents pose for photos with their graduates. Normal people living normal lives, blissfully unaware that somewhere in the world, people were planning to end those lives in service of their twisted ideology. I had 15 minutes to find Marcus and somehow explain why his father was about to vanish again, just like he had so many times throughout his childhood. But how do you tell your son that the man he just described as a failure in front of hundreds of people is actually being summoned to save the country? Marcus was surrounded by classmates and their families when I found him, his face glowing with the kind of pure joy that comes only once in a lifetime. He saw me approaching and his expression shifted, the happiness dimming slightly as he remembered who I was in his narrative of success despite obstacles. "Dad," he said, forcing a smile. "Thanks for coming. I know work is always so demanding for you." The irony cut deep. For 22 years I had let him believe that my absences were due to the demands of manual labor, that I was just another blue-collar worker struggling to make ends meet. The truth was that even in my exile, I had never fully left the shadow world. When former contacts needed expertise, when situations arose that required someone with my particular skill set, I had quietly answered the call. But those missions were off the books, paid in cash, and came with the understanding that they never happened. "Marcus, I need to tell you something," I began, but before I could continue, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his face lit up with excitement. "It's Dr. Peterson from Harvard Medical," he said. "They want to discuss my summer research program." "Can we talk later, Dad? This is important." I watched him walk away, already absorbed in his bright future, and I realized that once again, I was going to be relegated to the background of his life. The helicopter would arrive soon, and I would disappear into another classified mission while my son celebrated the biggest achievement of his young life. The pattern was repeating itself, just as it had when he was 3 years old and sick in the hospital. The sound of rotor blades echoed in the distance, growing louder by the second. I had maybe 5 minutes before a military helicopter landed on the high school football field and shattered any pretense of my civilian identity. Already, some of the other parents were looking around nervously, phones out to record what they assumed was some kind of emergency. I caught Marcus just as he was finishing his phone call, his face radiant with whatever good news Dr. Peterson had shared. "Son," I said, placing my hands on his shoulders, "something has come up at work. I have to leave for a few days." His expression fell, disappointment replacing excitement. "Of course you do," he said, the words heavy, with years of accumulated resentment. "You know what, Dad? I'm not even surprised anymore. This is exactly what I was talking about in my speech." The helicopter was directly overhead now, the downdraft from its rotors sending graduation programs flying across the parking lot. Parents were pointing, children were screaming with excitement, and security guards were frantically trying to figure out what was happening. "Marcus, this isn't what you think," I said, raising my voice over the growing noise. "I need you to understand that everything I've done, every choice I've made, has been to protect you." He shook his head, backing away from me as the helicopter began its descent toward the football field. "You're unbelievable," he said. "Even now, even on my graduation day, you're making this about yourself. Just go, Dad. Go to whatever job emergency is so much more important than your son." The pain in his voice was worse than any wound I'd ever sustained in combat. But there was no time to explain, no time to bridge the gap that 22 years of necessary lies had created between us. The helicopter had landed, and I could see figures in dark suits climbing out, scanning the crowd for me. "I'll explain everything when I get back," I promised. But Marcus was already walking away, lost in the crowd of celebrating families. I stood there for a moment, watching my son disappear just as I was about to do the same thing to him. The walk across the football field felt like the longest 100 yards of my life. Parents and students pressed against the fence, phones recording, voices raised in excitement and confusion. A military helicopter landing at a high school graduation wasn't exactly subtle, and I knew that by evening this would be all over social media. The lead figure waiting by the helicopter was a woman in her 50s, silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a black suit that screamed federal authority. She extended her hand as I approached, her grip firm and confident. "Colonel Chen, I'm Deputy Director Sarah Martinez, NSA. We appreciate you coming." "I didn't have much choice," I replied, climbing into the helicopter as she gestured toward the open door. The last thing I saw before we lifted off was Marcus standing at the edge of the crowd, his face upturned, watching his father disappear into the sky once again. The flight to Washington was a blur of briefings and classified documents. Director Martinez filled me in on the attacks, showing me satellite photos of the damage, casualty reports that made my stomach clench, and intercepted communications that proved beyond doubt that someone was using my old protocols against us. The most chilling piece of evidence was a video message from the terrorist leader, a man calling himself the Architect. In it, he spoke directly to the camera. his face hidden behind a mask, but his voice carrying the educated accent of someone who had spent time in American institutions. "You taught us well," he said in perfect English. "Your own playbook has become our blueprint. Every strategy you developed to protect your homeland now serves to destroy it. The student has become the teacher, and the lesson is about to begin." My blood ran cold as I recognized not just the tactics he was describing, but the specific language he was using. These weren't just my protocols he had stolen. These were my exact words, lifted from classified briefings I had given to a select group of military leaders in my final year at the Pentagon. Someone with access to those briefings was feeding information to the architect. Someone in our own government was enabling these attacks. And they had chosen to use my life's work as the weapon to betray my country. The helicopter began its descent toward a landing pad I recognized, though I hadn't seen it in over 2 decades. We were approaching the Pentagon, the building that had once been my second home and was now the scene of my return to a world I thought I had left forever. As we touched down, I realized that everything I had sacrificed to protect my family, everything I had given up to keep them safe, was about to be tested in ways I had never imagined. The classified life I had buried was clawing its way back to the surface, and this time, there might be no way to keep it separate from the man Marcus thought I was. The warehouse worker was about to become Colonel Chen again, whether I wanted it or not. The Pentagon's Situation Room hadn't changed much in 22 years. The same sterile white walls, the same massive screens displaying real-time intelligence feeds, the same atmosphere of controlled urgency that I remembered from my days as a briefing officer. What had changed was the technology and the faces around the table, most of whom were young enough to be my children. Secretary Wells sat at the head of the conference table, her steel-gray eyes fixed on me as I took my seat. To her right was General Patricia Harrison, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a woman whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by her intolerance for incompetence. The other faces were a mixture of intelligence analysts, counterterrorism specialists, and officials whose agencies I could only guess at based on their carefully neutral expressions. "Colonel Chen," Secretary Wells began, her voice cutting through the low hum of electronics, "in the past 6 hours, we've identified the source of the security breach." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. Director Martinez activated a wall display, and a photograph appeared that made my blood freeze. It was General Robert Kane, my former commanding officer, the man who had orchestrated my quiet exile from the Pentagon 2 decades ago. He was older now, his hair completely white, but the cold calculation in his eyes was exactly as I remembered. General Kane had Alpha-level clearance until his retirement 8 months ago, General Harrison explained. During his final week of active duty, he accessed dozens of classified files, including Operation Nightfall. We initially assumed it was routine archival work, preparing for his transition to civilian life. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Kane had never forgiven me for choosing family over duty, for proving that his rigid worldview was flawed. In his mind, I had betrayed everything the military stood for, and my subsequent success in civilian life had only deepened his resentment. But this wasn't just about revenge against me. Director Martinez clicked to the next slide, showing financial records that painted a devastating picture. Kane had accumulated massive gambling debts in his final years of service, debts that would have destroyed his reputation and pension if they became public. The terrorist organization had offered him a way out, purchasing classified information for enough money to clear his obligations and fund a comfortable retirement. "He sold out his own country for 30 pieces of silver," I said, the biblical reference feeling appropriate for the magnitude of his betrayal. The next slide showed intercepted communications between Kane and the architect, conversations that revealed the true scope of their plan. The attacks in Europe had been merely the opening move. The real target was a coordinated strike on American soil, designed to maximize casualties and cripple our ability to respond. "They planned to hit us during the 4th of July weekend," Secretary Wells said. "Simultaneous attacks on major population centers, using tactics specifically designed to overwhelm our standard response protocols. Without your insights into Operation Nightfall, we're flying blind." I studied the intelligence reports, my mind automatically shifting into the analytical mode that had once made me one of the Pentagon's most effective strategic planners. The terrorists weren't just using my protocols. They were inverting them, turning defensive strategies into offensive weapons. It was brilliant, diabolical, and utterly devastating in its simplicity. "What do you need from me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. General Harrison leaned forward, her expression grave. "We need you to think like them, Colonel. We need you to anticipate their next move and help us develop countermeasures. You created this system. You're the only one who can stop it." For the next 18 hours, I worked alongside the best minds in American intelligence, dissecting my own strategies and finding their weaknesses. It was like performing surgery on myself, cutting away pieces of my professional legacy to save the patient. Every scenario we developed, every countermeasure we proposed, required me to think like the man I had once been, while confronting the reality of who I had become. The breakthrough came at 3 a.m, when exhaustion had stripped away our conventional thinking and forced us to consider possibilities we might otherwise have dismissed. I was staring at a map of potential targets when I noticed a pattern that everyone else had missed. "They're not planning to hit major cities," I said, the realization hitting me like a thunderbolt. "They're planning to hit small towns, places with minimal security and maximum symbolic value. Places like where I live." The room went silent as the implications sank in. Attack on New York or Los Angeles would be expected, prepared for. But a coordinated strike on dozens of small American towns would be psychologically devastating, proving that nowhere was safe, that the government couldn't protect its own citizens in their supposed havens of security. My phone buzzed with an incoming call, and I glanced at the screen to see Marcus's name. My heart lurched as I realized what day it was. In my focus on the crisis, I had lost track of time. It was Sunday evening, 48 hours since I had disappeared from his graduation ceremony. "I need to take this," I said, stepping away from the table despite the protests of several officials who clearly thought a personal phone call was inappropriate during a national security crisis. "Dad?" Marcus's voice was strained, worried. "Where are you? I've been calling for 2 days. Mrs. Patterson said she saw you get into a helicopter at school. What's going on?" "I'm in Washington," I said, walking to a secure alcove where our conversation couldn't be overheard. "There's something happening at work, something I can't explain over the phone." "Work?" His voice rose with familiar frustration. "Dad, you load trucks for a living. What could possibly be so important that you disappear without explanation on my graduation weekend?" The pain in his voice was unbearable, made worse by the knowledge that I still couldn't tell him the truth. "Marcus, I know how this looks. I know you think I'm just making excuses again. But I need you to trust me when I say that what I'm doing right now is important. More important than anything I've ever done." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, defeated. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "You know what, Dad? I'm tired of trusting you. I'm tired of making excuses for you. Dr. Peterson offered me a position in his lab starting tomorrow, and I'm going to take it. I'll be staying in Boston for the summer." "Marcus?" "Wait," I said. But the line had already gone dead. I stood there for a moment, phone in my hand, feeling the weight of 22 years of necessary deceptions crushing down on me. In trying to protect my son from the dangerous world I inhabited, I had created an unbridgeable chasm between us. When I returned to the Situation Room, the team had refined our target predictions. Using my insights into the terrorists' likely strategies, we had identified 17 potential targets across 12 states. The attacks would begin in less than 72 hours, coordinated to maximize the psychological impact of American Independence Day. "We need boots on the ground at every location," General Harrison said. "But we can't use regular military assets without revealing our intelligence sources. This has to be a civilian operation, off the books." I looked around the table at the faces of people who had never been forced to choose between duty and family, who had never sacrificed their identities to protect the people they loved. Then I thought about Marcus, driving toward Boston and a future that would take him even further away from the father he thought he knew. "I'll go," I said, the words coming out before I had fully formed the decision. "I'll coordinate the field operations personally." Secretary Wells raised an eyebrow. "Colonel, with all due respect, you've been out of active duty for over 2 decades. This isn't a strategy session, it's a combat operation." "Ma'am," I replied, feeling something awakening inside me that had been dormant for 22 years. I've been hiding in plain sight for half my adult life. I know how to blend in, how to operate without official sanction, how to do what needs to be done without leaving fingerprints. And I have something the other operatives don't have. What's that? She asked. Nothing left to lose. The next 60 hours were a blur of covert operations, secure communications, and split-second decisions that would determine whether American families would wake up on the 4th of July or die in their sleep. I coordinated 17 simultaneous operations from a mobile command center, watching my old strategies play out in real time as my teams intercepted terrorist cells that had been planning to turn Independence Day into a national tragedy. The final operation took place in a small town in Ohio, less than 50 miles from where I had spent the last 22 years hiding in plain sight. The irony wasn't lost on me as I led a team of federal agents through the same kind of blue-collar neighborhood where I had raised my son. We found the terrorist cell in an abandoned warehouse that could have been the twin of the one where I worked. The leader was a young man, no older than Marcus, whose eyes burned with the same kind of idealistic fervor that had once driven me to serve my country. The difference was that his idealism had been twisted into something monstrous, something that celebrated death instead of protecting life. When it was over, when the last terrorist had been captured and the final bomb had been defused, I stood in the parking lot of that warehouse and realized that everything had changed. The classified life I had buried was now public record. The cover identity I had maintained for 2 decades was blown beyond repair. The man who had loaded trucks and kept his head down was gone forever. My phone rang as I was debriefing with the federal team. It was Marcus, calling from Boston. "Dad," he said, his voice shaking, "I just saw the news. They're saying you're some kind of hero, that you stopped terrorist attacks. They're calling you Colonel Chen." I don't understand. I sat down on the hood of my truck, the same battered Ford I had driven to his graduation 3 days earlier, and for the first time in 22 years, I told my son the truth. All of it. The career I had sacrificed for his mother's medical bills, the classification that had erased my service record, the dangerous missions I had undertaken to keep food on our table, the impossible choice between protecting him and being honest with him. When I finished, there was silence on the line. Then Marcus spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave up everything for us," he said. "Your career, your identity, your legacy. All these years, I thought you were ashamed of what you'd become. But you became exactly what we needed you to be." The conversation that followed lasted for hours, 22 years of misunderstandings and missed connections, finally being swept away by truth. Marcus told me about the full scholarship he had earned, the research position at Harvard, the bright future that stretched out before him. I told him about the pride I had felt watching him grow into the kind of man his mother would have loved, the kind of leader our country needed. When we finally hung up, I was sitting in my small apartment, surrounded by the modest possessions of a warehouse worker who no longer existed. Tomorrow there would be debriefings and congressional hearings. There would be job offers and security clearances, and a return to the world I had left behind. But tonight, there was just a father and son who had finally found their way back to each other. The ghost I had been for 22 years was finally at rest, and the man I had always been was free to step into the light. My phone buzzed with a text message from Marcus. "Thanks for saving the country, Dad. But mostly, thanks for saving us." I smiled, feeling a peace I hadn't known since Sarah died. The mission was complete. The price had been paid. And for the first time in over 2 decades, Colonel David Chen was coming home. 6 months later, I stood in the same auditorium where Marcus had delivered his graduation speech. But this time, the circumstances were entirely different. The Ohio State University had invited me to speak at their military appreciation ceremony, and the irony of returning to the place where my double life had finally unraveled wasn't lost on me. The audience was a mix of ROTC cadets, veterans, and military families, their faces reflecting the same kind of pride and purpose I remembered from my younger days. But scattered throughout the crowd were also people from my neighborhood, former coworkers from the warehouse, neighbors who had known me only as the quiet single father who kept to himself. Mrs. Patterson sat in the 3rd row, the same woman who had gossiped about my supposed failures at Marcus's graduation. Beside her was Jim Rodriguez, my former supervisor at the warehouse, whose expression showed a mixture of confusion and newfound respect. These were people who had built their understanding of me on 22 years of carefully constructed fiction, and now they were struggling to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the decorated colonel standing before them. As I approached the podium, I caught sight of a familiar figure in the back of the auditorium. Marcus had flown in from Boston, taking time away from his research program to hear his father speak publicly for the first time in over 2 decades. The pride in his eyes was everything I had hoped to see during his own graduation speech 6 months earlier. The university president had introduced me with a list of commendations and achievements that sounded like they belonged to someone else. Distinguished Service Medal, Bronze Star with Valor, Purple Heart, Architect of Counterterrorism Protocols that had saved countless lives. Each accolade was true, but hearing them spoken aloud after so many years of anonymity felt surreal. I began my speech not with military accomplishments, but with a confession. For 22 years, I told the audience, I lived among you as David Chen, the warehouse worker. I drove the same roads, shopped at the same stores, worried about the same bills that keep all of us awake at night. Many of you knew me as the guy who worked double shifts to pay for his son's education, who drove an old truck and wore secondhand clothes to parent-teacher conferences. A murmur went through the crowd as people recognized themselves in my description, remembering interactions they'd had with the man they thought was just another struggling single parent. What you didn't know, I continued, was that every choice I made, every sacrifice that looked like failure from the outside, was actually the most successful mission of my entire career. My job wasn't to command troops or brief generals. My job was to raise a son who would become the kind of man our country needs, and to do it while keeping him safe from enemies who would have used him against me. I talked about the real cost of classified service, not just the danger and the secrecy, but the isolation that comes from never being able to share your true self with the people you love most. I spoke about Sarah's illness and the choice between career advancement and family survival, about the weight of watching your child grow up, believing his father was a disappointment. The most difficult part of my speech came when I addressed the young ROTC cadets in the audience, bright-faced kids who reminded me of myself at their age. I told them about the myth of the military hero, the dangerous fiction that service means choosing duty over family, country over personal relationships. Real strength, I said, looking directly at those young faces, isn't about being invulnerable. It's about being vulnerable for the right reasons. It's about understanding that sometimes the most patriotic thing you can do is put your family first. Because the families we protect are what make our country worth defending in the first place. After the ceremony, the reception was unlike anything I had experienced in my adult life. For the first time in decades, I was surrounded by people who knew both versions of my story, the classified colonel and the warehouse worker, and were trying to understand how they fit together. General Harrison had flown in from Washington for the event, and she approached me with an offer I had been expecting. "The Pentagon wants you back, David," she said, using my first name with the casual familiarity that comes only after shared combat. "Full bird colonel, your own task force, unlimited resources. You can write your own ticket." I appreciated the offer more than she could know, but my answer surprised even me. "Thank you, General, but I'm not the same man who left the Pentagon 22 years ago. I've learned things in civilian life that you can't learn in any military academy or war college. I've learned that sometimes the best way to serve your country is to serve your community first." Instead of returning to active duty, I had accepted a position as a civilian consultant, splitting my time between advising the Pentagon on counterterrorism strategy and teaching courses at the local community college. It was an unusual arrangement, but one that allowed me to use my skills while staying connected to the life I had built in Ohio. The most unexpected conversation of the evening came from Tom Bradley, a man whose son had graduated alongside Marcus. Tom had been one of the parents whispering about my supposed failures 6 months earlier, and his embarrassment was obvious as he approached me at the reception. "Colonel," he said, clearly struggling with how to address me, "I owe you an apology. I said some things about you at Marcus's graduation that I deeply regret. I judged you without knowing anything about your real situation." I stopped him before he could continue. "Tom, you judged me based on the information you had. That's what good parents do. They pay attention to the people around their children. The fact that the information was incomplete wasn't your fault. But how do you handle it?" he asked, his voice dropping to a more personal level. How do you deal with people thinking less of you when you know they're wrong? It was a question I had wrestled with for over 2 decades, and the answer had evolved significantly since my return to public life. You have to decide what matters more, I told him. Being understood or being effective. For 22 years, I chose to be effective, to focus on the mission rather than the recognition. Now I have the luxury of being both. The real test of my new life came 3 weeks later, when I received a call that brought back all the old fears and protective instincts. Marcus had been approached by reporters digging into my story, looking for family perspectives on the decorated colonel who had hidden in plain sight for over 2 decades. "Dad," Marcus said when he called to tell me about the interview requests, "they want to know everything. About Mom's illness. About growing up thinking you were just a warehouse worker. About what it was like discovering the truth. Should I talk to them?" The old me, the man who had spent decades protecting his family through secrecy, wanted to tell him to refuse all interviews, to maintain the privacy we had fought so hard to preserve. But I realized that approach had created more problems than it had solved. "It's your story too, son," I said. "You have the right to tell it however you want. Just remember that once it's public, it belongs to everyone. Make sure you're comfortable with that." Marcus's interview, when it aired 2 months later, was everything I could have hoped for. He spoke with the same eloquence and thoughtfulness that had made him valedictorian, but this time he was telling a story of discovery rather than disappointment. He talked about learning to see strength in what he had perceived as weakness, about understanding that his father's absences had been presence in a different form. The most powerful moment came when the interviewer asked him about his future plans. Marcus looked directly into the camera and said, "I'm going to be a military doctor. Not because my father was a soldier, but because he taught me that the most important mission anyone can have is taking care of the people who can't take care of themselves." Watching that interview from my apartment, the same small space where I had lived as a warehouse worker, I felt a completion I hadn't known was possible. The circle had closed, but not in the way I had expected. Instead of returning to my old life, I had created something entirely new, something that honored both the man I had been and the man I had become. The phone rang as the interview ended, and I was surprised to see Secretary Wells's number on the caller ID. "Colonel," she said without preamble, "we've been monitoring the public response to your story. The reaction has been overwhelmingly positive, but more importantly, we're seeing a significant uptick in military recruitment applications. Young people are responding to your message about service and sacrifice." "That's gratifying to hear, ma'am," I replied, though I wasn't sure where the conversation was headed. "We'd like you to consider a new position," she continued. "Director of Military Family Services, a cabinet-level appointment that would put you in charge of supporting military families dealing with classified service issues. Families like yours was." The offer was tempting, a chance to help other families navigate the impossible choices I had faced. But it would also mean returning to Washington full-time, leaving behind the community that had unknowingly sheltered me for over 2 decades. "I need some time to think about it," I said, and Secretary Wells agreed to give me a week to decide. That evening, I drove to the cemetery where Sarah was buried, something I did whenever I faced major decisions. Her headstone was simple, bearing only her name, dates, and the inscription "Beloved Wife and Mother." I had never been able to add "widow of a decorated veteran," because my service record hadn't officially existed when she died. I told her about the job offer, about Marcus's interview, about the strange turn my life had taken since leaving the warehouse. As always, sitting by her grave brought clarity to complicated situations. Sarah had never wanted me to sacrifice my identity for her medical bills. She had argued against my resignation right up until the end, insisting that my service to the country was too important to abandon for one family's crisis. But she had also understood why I made the choice I did, because she would have made the same choice for Marcus and me. Now, facing another crossroads, I realized that the decision wasn't really about choosing between service and family anymore. It was about finding a way to honor both, to use the lessons I had learned in the shadows, to help others avoid the same painful choices. I accepted Secretary Wells's offer the next morning, but with conditions. I would take the position, but I would operate out of a regional office in Ohio rather than relocating to Washington. I would maintain my teaching position at the community college, because staying connected to civilian life was essential to understanding the families I would be serving. Most importantly, I would ensure that no other military family would have to choose between classified service and honest relationships with their children. The program I designed would provide support, resources, and most critically, age-appropriate ways to help military children understand their parents' sacrifices without compromising operational security. The irony wasn't lost on me that it had taken losing my anonymity to truly find my purpose. For 22 years, I had hidden in plain sight, believing that secrecy was the only way to protect the people I loved. Now I understood that the real protection came from community, from transparency, and from refusing to let the demands of service eclipse the humanity that makes service meaningful. 6 months after accepting the cabinet position, I received the most important validation of my new approach. It came in the form of a letter from a 10-year-old girl whose Navy SEAL father had been deployed for most of her life. Using the new protocols my office had developed, her family had found ways to maintain connection and understanding, despite the classified nature of his work. "Thank you for helping my daddy explain why he has to go away," she wrote in careful block letters. "I still miss him, but now I understand that he's protecting families like mine all over the world. When I grow up, I want to protect families too." Reading that letter in my Pentagon office, surrounded by the trappings of returned status and official recognition, I finally understood what success really looked like. It wasn't about medals or commendations or classified missions that would never appear in history books. It was about making sure that service and family could coexist, that protecting the country didn't require sacrificing the very relationships that gave life meaning. The warehouse worker and the colonel had finally become the same person, and for the first time in my adult life, I was exactly where I belonged. 2 years had passed since that June morning when a helicopter had landed on a high school football field and changed everything. Now, standing in the Rose Garden of the White House, I watched President Morrison prepare to sign the Military Family Transparency Act into law, legislation that bore my name and carried the weight of countless families who had suffered in silence. The assembled crowd included senators, military leaders, and advocacy groups, but my eyes were fixed on the small section reserved for family members. Marcus stood there in his navy dress whites, having graduated from Harvard Medical School and completed his commission as a military physician. Beside him was Elena, his fiancée, a brilliant young woman who had chosen to love a man whose father's story had become national news. The president's voice carried across the South Lawn as he spoke about the importance of supporting military families, about the courage required to serve in the shadows, and about the new era of transparency the legislation would create. But I was thinking about Sarah, wishing she could see what her sacrifice had ultimately made possible. The act itself was comprehensive, addressing everything from family communication protocols during classified deployments to mental health support for children of covert operatives. Most importantly, it established the principle that service to country should strengthen, rather than strain family bonds, that protecting national security didn't require destroying personal relationships. After the ceremony, as the crowd dispersed into smaller groups for the reception, I found myself approached by a young woman in an army uniform. She was maybe 25, with the bearing of someone who had already seen more than her share of difficult assignments. "Colonel Chen," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I wanted to thank you personally. My name is Captain Jessica Torres. My father was killed in a classified operation when I was 12. For 10 years, I believed he died in a training accident, because that's what they told us. It wasn't until I joined the Army myself that I learned the truth about his heroism." Her story was heartbreakingly familiar. Another family destroyed by the well-intentioned lies we tell to protect national security. The difference was that under the new legislation, her children would never have to wonder about their parents' legacy or question their family's honor. Captain Torres continued, her voice growing stronger. "I'm being deployed next month to a classified assignment in Southeast Asia. My daughter is 8 years old, the same age I was when my father started disappearing on mysterious trips. But thanks to your program, she'll understand why mommy has to go away, and she'll never doubt that it's because I love her enough to fight for her future." These were the moments that made everything worthwhile. the knowledge that other families would be spared the pain of unnecessary secrets. But even as I celebrated these victories, I carried the weight of knowing how much time had been lost, how many relationships had been damaged by the old ways of thinking. The reception moved inside to the East Room, where I found myself in conversation with General Martinez, who had taken over as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. She was describing the implementation challenges of the new protocols when my phone buzzed with an urgent message. It was from Director Sullivan at the CIA, a man whose calls usually meant that somewhere in the world crisis was brewing. "Colonel," the message read, "we have a situation developing in Eastern Europe. 3 American contractors have been taken hostage by a paramilitary group. The kidnappers are demanding the release of classified information about Operation Nightfall. They specifically asked for you by name." My blood chilled as I read the details. The hostages were civilian engineers working on infrastructure projects, innocent people who had been targeted because of their nationality. The kidnappers claimed to be followers of the architect, the terrorist leader we had defeated 2 years earlier, and they wanted to finish what he had started. I excused myself from the reception and found a secure phone in the West Wing. Director Sullivan answered on the first ring, his voice tense with the controlled urgency that comes with American lives hanging in the balance. "Colonel," he said, "we've been tracking this group for 6 months. They're not as sophisticated as the architects' organization, but they're desperate enough to be dangerous. They've given us 72 hours to produce you for an exchange, or they'll start executing hostages." The familiar weight of impossible choices settled on my shoulders. These people had been targeted because of me, because my name and my work had become symbols in a war. One thought was over. 3 innocent lives hung in the balance, and I was the only currency the kidnappers would accept. "Sir," I said, already knowing what I was going to do, "I'll need a team and full operational authority. We're not negotiating with terrorists, but we are bringing those people home." The next 18 hours were a blur of intelligence briefings, tactical planning, and the controlled chaos that precedes high-risk operations. The hostages were being held in an abandoned Soviet-era facility in the mountains of Georgia, a location chosen specifically because it was isolated, defensible, and symbolic of resistance to Western influence. What made this operation particularly challenging was that it couldn't be officially sanctioned by any government. The hostages were civilians, the location was in a politically sensitive region, and any American military action could trigger international incidents that would ripple for years. This was exactly the kind of shadow operation I had spent my career perfecting, the type of mission that existed in the gray areas between official policy and operational necessity. But this time, I wasn't a young colonel with everything to prove. I was a man in his 50s with everything to lose, particularly the family relationships I had spent the last 2 years rebuilding. Marcus found me in the Pentagon briefing room at 3 a.m, poring over satellite images of the target location. He had driven down from Baltimore, still wearing his hospital scrubs from his residency rotation. "Dad," he said, sitting down across from me at the conference table, "Mom's watching the news. She knows something's happening. Are you really going to do this?" Elena was more than Marcus's fiancée. She had become like a daughter to me, and I knew she worried about the dangerous pull of my old life. She had seen how easily I slipped back into the role of operational commander, how the adrenaline of crisis planning brought out both the best and the most obsessive aspects of my personality. "I have to," I told Marcus, gesturing at the photos spread across the table. "These people were targeted because of me. Their families are going through what we went through, wondering if their loved ones are coming home. I can't let that happen if I have the power to stop it." Marcus studied the intelligence reports with the analytical mind that had made him an exceptional medical student. "Then what do you need from me?" he asked, surprising me with his directness. "I need you to understand that this isn't about choosing duty over family anymore," I said. "This is about using everything I've learned, both as a soldier and as a father, to bring other people's children home. The mission isn't separate from family. The mission is about protecting families." The operation itself was a masterpiece of precision and restraint. Working with a hand-picked team of special operations veterans, we infiltrated the facility during a thunderstorm that masked our approach and disrupted the kidnappers' communications. The rescue took less than 12 minutes from breach to extraction, with all 3 hostages recovered safely and minimal casualties among the terrorist group. But the real victory came in what happened afterward. Instead of disappearing back into the shadows like operations of the past, we immediately contacted the families of the rescued hostages, providing them with full briefings about what had happened and why. We held press conferences, answered questions from Congress, and demonstrated that transparency and operational success could coexist. The hostage families became powerful advocates for the new approach to classified operations. They spoke publicly about the difference it made to know the truth about their ordeal, to understand that their suffering had meaning, and that their government valued their lives enough to risk international complications for their rescue. 6 months later, I received an invitation that would have been unthinkable during my years in exile. Harvard Medical School was hosting a symposium on combat medicine, and Marcus had suggested me as a keynote speaker. The irony of addressing the institution where my son had excelled, speaking about the intersection of military service and medical ethics, wasn't lost on me. The auditorium was filled with medical students, military physicians, and researchers working on trauma care innovations. But the most meaningful presence was Marcus himself, introducing his father to his academic community for the first time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the confidence that comes from truly knowing your subject. "It's my honor to introduce Colonel David Chen, architect of modern family-centered military service protocols, hero of the Eastern European hostage crisis, and the man who taught me that the most important battles are fought not for glory, but for the people we love." My speech that day wasn't about tactics or strategy, but about the evolution of what it means to serve. I talked about the outdated notion that military effectiveness requires personal sacrifice, about how the strongest soldiers are those who fight not from a place of isolation, but from deep connection to the values they're protecting. The most powerful moment came during the question and answer session, when a young medical student asked about the psychological impact of classified service on military families. I found myself thinking not about policy papers or statistical analyses, but about the small moments that had defined my relationship with Marcus over the years. The real damage, I told her, doesn't come from the danger or the secrecy. It comes from the loneliness, from feeling like you can't share the most important parts of yourself with the people you love most. The new protocols we've developed aren't just about operational security, they're about operational humanity. After the symposium, Marcus and I walked through Harvard Yard, the same paths he had traveled as a student while I was still hiding my identity in Ohio. The autumn leaves were brilliant against the historic brick buildings, and for the first time, I felt like I truly belonged in his world. "Dad," he said as we sat on a bench near the medical school, "I've been thinking about specializing in military trauma psychology. I want to work with families dealing with classified service issues, help them navigate the challenges you and I went through." The idea of Marcus dedicating his career to helping other families avoid our painful journey filled me with a pride that transcended any military decoration I had ever received. He wasn't following in my footsteps. He was building his own path that honored our shared experience while addressing its shortcomings. A year later, the first annual Conference on Military Family Wellness was held in Washington, bringing together researchers, policymakers, and families affected by classified service. The keynote panel featured 3 speakers: myself as the architect of the new protocols, Dr. Marcus Chen as a researcher in military family psychology, and Captain Torres, now returned from her deployment and serving as a family advocate. The conference attracted international attention, with allies from around the world seeking to implement similar programs. But the most meaningful moment came when Elena announced her engagement to Marcus during the closing ceremony, choosing to make their commitment public in front of the community that had become their extended family. Standing on the stage that night, looking out at an audience of people who had dedicated their lives to supporting military families, I felt the completion of a journey that had begun with a sick 3-year-old and his father's impossible choice. The warehouse worker who had hidden in shame was gone forever, but so was the colonel who had believed that service required sacrifice of family relationships. In their place stood a man who had learned that the strongest foundation for public service is private love, that the most effective protection of national values begins with protection of personal bonds. The mission had evolved, but it had never ended. It had simply expanded to include everyone who understood that serving others, starts with serving the people closest to home. The last speaker of the conference was a 12-year-old girl whose Army Ranger father had been deployed on classified missions for most of her life. Using the new family communication protocols, she had maintained a close relationship with him despite his frequent absences. Her final words captured everything we had worked to achieve. "My daddy is a hero," she said, her young voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "But the best part isn't that he fights bad guys in faraway places. The best part is that he never stopped being my daddy, even when he couldn't tell me where he was going or when he would come back. Now I know that protecting our family and protecting our country are the same mission." As the conference ended and the crowd dispersed, I stood with Marcus and Elena in the lobby, watching families reconnect after 3 days of workshops and presentations. These were people who had learned to navigate the complexities of classified service without sacrificing their relationships, who had found ways to be both patriots and parents, both warriors and family members. My phone buzzed with a message from Director Sullivan. Another crisis was developing somewhere in the world, another situation that would require the careful balance of operational effectiveness and family consideration that had become my specialty. But for the first time in my career, the summons didn't feel like a burden or a choice between competing loyalties. It felt like coming home to a mission that finally made complete sense. Serving a country by serving its families. Protecting freedom by protecting the relationships that give freedom meaning. The ghost who had haunted my family for 2 decades was finally at peace. And the man who remained was exactly who he was meant to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.